The heir to the British throne has quietly signed off on the framework of an emergency regency, and the ink on that private authorization is already drying inside a sealed folder that no camera will ever be allowed to photograph. It was not the illness that finally moved the machinery of the crown. It was the silence that came after it. For weeks, the king had insisted on being seen, on standing when standing hurt, on smiling when smiling took more from him than any audience could measure. But somewhere in the small, sleepless hours of the previous night, a threshold was crossed that could not be uncrossed. A doctor closed a folder. A private secretary lowered his eyes. A son sat down in a chair his father had always occupied, and did not stand up again for a very long time. What happened in that room was not a coronation and not a collapse, but something stranger and more consequential. A quiet transfer of gravity from one man to another, executed without ceremony, without cameras, without warning. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room in question was not the grand red-carpeted chamber of official portraiture, but a smaller working study on an upper floor, paneled in dark wood, warmed by a single low lamp, and utterly unremarkable to anyone who did not know its history. The curtains had been drawn earlier than usual. The clock on the mantel had been allowed to run down, its ticking absent for the first time in living memory of the household. 3 chairs had been set, though only 2 were occupied. On the desk between them lay a folder bound in dark leather, and beside the folder a fountain pen, uncapped, resting on a small square of blotting paper. That mattered because in this household nothing was ever left uncapped by accident. An uncapped pen was a decision waiting to be made, a sentence waiting to be signed, a life waiting to be rearranged. The Prince of Wales stood at the window for a long moment before he sat. He did not look at the folder. He looked at the garden below, at the lawn his father had walked as a young man, and then, without a word, he crossed the carpet and lowered himself into the chair. A private secretary, standing at a respectful distance, did not need to be told what came next. He simply opened the folder and turned it toward the son of the king. For the prince, the moment was not fear, though fear was in the room. It was not grief, though grief was already gathering at the edges of his composure. It was the sudden, unfamiliar weight of a role he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit, and had, in some quiet corner of his mind, always hoped to inherit later. Much later, when he was older, when his own children were grown, when the world had grown gentler. That mattered because a reluctant successor is never the same as an eager one. The reluctant successor carries the crown as a debt. The eager one carries it as a prize. History has always known the difference, even when the public has not. For the Queen, waiting in a room 2 corridors away, the moment was not a bulletin. It was a memory returning. She had sat beside this man through decades of small illnesses and large ones, through public triumphs and private wounds the country would never see. And she had learned to read the shift in his breathing the way sailors read the sky. She had known before the doctors said it aloud that the night had turned. That mattered because the steady stabilizer of any royal household is rarely the crowned figure. It is the one who counts the pills, who marks the calendar, who knows which chair he prefers when the pain is bad. Her steadiness that morning was not composure, it was practice. For the king's most senior private secretary, a man whose name the public would struggle to recall, and whose fingerprints were on every consequential document of the last decade. The moment was procedural. He had drafted the framework long ago, updated it quietly through successive winters, and kept it in a drawer that only 3 people in the country had a key to. That mattered because the machinery of monarchy does not improvise. It rehearses. It rehearses for decades, in silence, so that when the hour comes, no one in the room has to think. They only have to sign. And for the king himself, propped upright in a bed 1 floor above, aware in the way that only the very ill are aware of the arrangements being made on their behalf, the moment was neither surrender nor relief. It was recognition. He had asked for this. He had asked for it in a private conversation weeks earlier, in a tone his son had never heard him use before. And he had asked for it again in a written note preserved in a family memorandum that will one day, decades from now, be read by historians who will finally understand what this morning cost him. That mattered because a fading center does not always fight the fading. Sometimes he chooses the hour. Sometimes he chooses the successor. And sometimes, in the last exercise of a sovereign will, he chooses the silence in which it will be done. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a dinner held 6 weeks earlier, in a dining room smaller than the public imagines, at a table set for 4. The king had eaten little. The queen had watched him eat little. The Prince of Wales had been summoned late, arriving still in his traveling coat, and the Princess of Wales had been asked, gently and without explanation, to remain at home with the children. That mattered because in this family, who is invited to a room is always as important as what is said inside it. The absent guest is often the loudest voice at the table. That evening, only 3 chairs were filled, and the 4th, set out of habit, remained empty through the whole meal. A small white napkin folded on a small white plate, a silent placeholder for a conversation that could not yet be had in front of anyone else. The king had spoken first, and he had spoken plainly. He had described his condition not in the language of press releases, which is designed to soothe, but in the language of a man who has read his own charts and drawn his own conclusions. He had used the word Regency once, quietly, and then he had not used it again for the rest of the meal. A regency, in simple terms, is a legal arrangement in which the duties of a sovereign are exercised by another person, usually the direct heir, when the sovereign is unable to perform them through illness or absence. It is not an abdication. It is not a coronation. It is a bridge. That distinction, subtle to outsiders, was the entire architecture of the evening. The king was not giving up the crown. He was building a bridge his son would have to walk before the crown could be given up at all. The prince had not answered immediately. He had looked at his mother, who had not looked back at him, because she had been looking at her husband, and in that triangle of glances an entire understanding was reached without a single further sentence. The queen had known first, because she always knew first. The prince learned that evening. And the country would learn on a morning like this one, weeks later, when the machinery had been readied, and the folder had been placed on the desk, and the pen had been uncapped and left to wait. The confrontation, if it could be called that, happened not that night, but 3 days later, in a private sitting room whose windows faced east and caught the early light. The prince had returned alone, without staff, without a car in the front drive, having walked the last portion of the journey through a garden path he had known since childhood. He had come to argue. He had come, in truth, to refuse. That mattered because the reluctant successor does not resist the throne out of weakness. He resists it out of love. He resists it because to accept it is to accept, in the same breath, the ending of the man who wore it before him. The king had been waiting in his chair by the window. He had not risen. He had not offered tea. He had simply gestured to the chair opposite and let the silence do the work that words would only have cluttered. For a long time, neither man spoke. The clock on the wall was the only voice in the room, and even it seemed to lower its tone. The prince had eventually spoken first, and he had spoken in half-sentences, in the way sons speak to fathers when the subject is too large for grammar. He had said something about time. He had said something about not yet. He had said something about wanting his father to fight, to keep going, to see one more Christmas, one more garden in bloom, one more of the small, ordinary mornings that had become, in this last year, the only mornings that mattered. The king had listened. He had let his son finish. And then he had said, in a voice so quiet the private secretary, listening from the next room later, described it only as a breath shaped into a sentence, that the country did not need a fighting king. It needed a working one. That mattered because in a single line the sovereign had defined the terms of his own exit, not as defeat, not as illness, not as surrender, but as a strategic handover from a symbol who could no longer work to a successor who could. The prince had lowered his head. He had not agreed. But he had not refused again. And in that space, in the pause between refusal and acceptance, the regency had already begun. By the following week, the machinery was already moving, though no one outside a very small circle would have noticed. Diaries were rearranged in ways that seemed, on the surface, unremarkable. 2 engagements the king had been scheduled to attend were quietly reassigned to the Prince of Wales, described in the official language as a matter of scheduling convenience. A folder of red boxes, the daily working papers of the sovereign that arrive by dispatch each evening and must be read, annotated, and signed, began to be duplicated. A dispatch box, in simple terms, is a locked leather case in which government papers are delivered to the monarch for review, and it has been the physical instrument of royal work for generations. That mattered because when a second set of keys is quietly cut, when a second desk is quietly prepared, when a second signature is quietly practiced, the transfer of power has already happened in every way except the announcement. A card was removed from a table in a state dining room, a small placement card bearing the king's name and title, and replaced with a card bearing his son's. It was a rehearsal. No dinner was held that night. The staff who set the table were not told why. They only knew that the arrangement had changed. And in a household where nothing changes without meaning, the meaning was already being absorbed in silence. An empty chair at the head of a rehearsal table is not an empty chair. It is a countdown. The second warning came in the early hours of the previous night, and it did not come through a press office. It came through a telephone. A doctor made a call. A private secretary made another. A car left a country estate at a speed that would have drawn attention on any other night. But on this night, the roads were empty, and the drivers had been chosen for their discretion. By the time the sun rose, 3 additional physicians had arrived. A chaplain had been quietly asked to remain within the grounds, and the framework of the emergency regency, which had until then existed as a contingency, was moved into the category of active preparation. That mattered because, in the language of the crown, the distinction between contingency and active is the distinction between winter and the first frost. One is theoretical, the other is on the glass. The king's condition, described in the careful language of the medical bulletin that would later be prepared but not yet released, had worsened overnight in a way that did not permit optimism. He was conscious, he was lucid in intervals, he had asked twice about his son, he had asked once about his wife, he had asked only once and very quietly about the folder. When the folder was brought to him, he had rested his hand on it for a long moment without opening it, and then he had nodded. A single small nod. The last executive act of a sovereign who had spent a lifetime learning that the smallest gestures are the ones history records most faithfully. The prince, informed by the doctors before he was informed by anyone else, had already been walking the length of a long corridor when the news reached him formally. He did not stop. He did not speak. He simply continued walking, past the portraits of his ancestors, past the small sitting rooms he had run through as a child, past the tall windows that looked out on gardens he had once believed would belong to his father forever. That mattered because in the private life of the man who would now carry the working weight of the crown, this walk was the crossing. He entered it as a son. He would leave it as something more, and something less, and something he would spend the rest of his life learning to be. The intimate scene, the one no camera will record and no biographer will ever fully reconstruct, took place in the king's bedroom in the middle of the afternoon. The queen had left the room, briefly, to allow father and son a moment without her. The private secretaries had withdrawn. The doctors had stepped into the corridor. For perhaps 20 minutes, there were no titles in the room. There was no king. There was no heir. There was a father in a bed and a son in a chair, and there was the terrible, ordinary intimacy of a family reckoning with a fact no family ever reckons with in time. They did not speak of the crown. They spoke of a dog, long dead, that the son had loved as a child. They spoke of a river the father had once tried and failed to teach the son to fish. They spoke of the son's own children, and the father asked, in a voice thinned by illness but not by tenderness, whether they were sleeping well, whether the youngest had gotten over his fear of the dark, whether the eldest was still reading the book they had discussed on the previous visit. That mattered because in the last hours of a reign and in the first hours of a regency, the machinery of state is not what steadies the men who must carry it. What steadies them is the memory of small human things, a dog, a river, a child afraid of the dark. These are the anchors a man reaches for when the weight of history is placed in his hands. Before the son left the room, The father asked him for one thing. He did not ask him to be a great king, because greatness cannot be requested. He did not ask him to be a wise king, because wisdom cannot be inherited. He asked him only to be a present king, to be in the rooms he was needed in, to sit in the chairs he was expected to sit in, to sign the papers that must be signed, and to remember that the crown is heavier when it is worn lightly and lighter when it is worn heavily, and that no one, in the long history of the family, had ever gotten that balance entirely right. The son took his father's hand. He did not answer in words. He simply held it, for a long time, until the father's grip loosened into sleep, and then he stood, and he crossed the room, and he closed the door behind him with a care that was itself a kind of promise. By the time evening fell, the news, or the shape of the news, had already begun to move through the country in the way that important news always moves before it is officially announced. A broadcaster, receiving a call from a source who had received a call from another source, changed the tone of the evening bulletin without changing its words. A newspaper editor held the front page open past its usual deadline, waiting. A crowd, small at first, then larger, began to gather at the gates of the palace, drawn by an instinct older than any press release, the ancient instinct of a people who sense that the center of their national life is shifting and who wish to be president, even in silence, even in the cold, when the shift occurs. An older woman, standing at the front of the gathering crowd with a small bunch of flowers she had not yet decided where to place, was heard to say only that she remembered him as a young man, and that she was sorry, and that she hoped he was not in pain. She did not give her name. She did not speak to a camera. She spoke instead to no one in particular, in the way that grief sometimes speaks when it has nowhere else to go. That mattered because the public reaction to a moment like this is never captured in polls or in official statements. It is captured in the small, unposed sentences of ordinary people who have lost, or fear they are about to lose, a figure whose face they have known for longer than they have known most members of their own families. The newspapers, working through the night, prepared their front pages with the restraint that such moments demand. One headline reads simply, in a single word set a size larger than any of the others, the word Regency, and beneath it a photograph of the king as he had been 10 years earlier, in a garden, in the sun, laughing at something no one now remembered. Another chose a photograph of the Prince of Wales, taken only that afternoon as he left the palace, his face composed, his eyes elsewhere, a man walking through a door he had not chosen to open. A third chose no photograph at all, only a blank page with a small crest at the top, a design decision so unusual that it was itself the story. That mattered because when a nation's newspapers begin to speak in symbols rather than in sentences, the story has already passed beyond the reach of ordinary language. Inside the palace, meanwhile, the machinery continued its quiet work. The folder that had been left on the desk that morning was signed in the early evening. Not with ceremony, not with witnesses beyond those legally required, but with the same fountain pen that had rested uncapped on its square of blotting paper hours earlier. The prince signed his own name in full, in the careful hand he had been taught as a boy, and then he set the pen down, capped it, and returned it to the small silver tray on which it had always been kept. A private secretary lifted the folder, closed it, and carried it from the room. A second folder, containing the medical documentation required to activate the Regency framework, followed a moment later. The clock on the mantel, which had been allowed to run down that morning, was quietly rewound by a member of the household staff, and it began once again to tick. The Princess of Wales, informed by her husband in a brief telephone call earlier in the afternoon, had already begun the small, invisible work that would fall to her in the days and weeks ahead. She had cleared her diary. She had spoken to the children. In the careful, honest way she had always spoken to them about difficult things, and she had asked them, gently, not to be frightened, and not to be sad in front of their grandfather when they saw him next, because he was tired, and because tired people need to be met with quiet, and not with tears. That mattered because in the emotional architecture of a royal household, the person who holds the family together is often the person whose name appears last in the official communiques. The steady stabilizer works in the margins. She works in the school runs and the bedtime stories and the small reassurances that no historian will ever record. Elsewhere in the family, the reactions refracted according to the private grammar of each figure. The king's brother, a man cast for most of his adult life as the displaced insider, received the news in a room of his own and spent a long time at a window that faced no particular view. He had spent decades on the edges of a story whose center he had never quite been permitted to occupy. And now the story was moving further from him still, into a generation that regarded him with affection but not with reliance. He did not speak to anyone for several hours. When he did, it was only to ask, quietly, whether his brother had eaten. That mattered because in families and in monarchies, the displaced insider often reveals himself most fully in the smallness of his questions. He did not ask about power. He asked about supper. The king's sister, cast for a lifetime as the truth-teller, the one who said what others would not, received the news at her own residence and did not weep. She had wept earlier, weeks before, when the diagnosis had first been shared within the family, and she had made a private decision then to spend the remaining tears in private, so that when the public moment came she could stand as she had always stood, upright, unshaken, a woman whose face gave nothing away, because her heart had already given everything in rooms no one had been permitted to enter. She wrote a short note to her nephew that evening. She did not send it by any official channel. She sent it by hand, carried by a driver she had known for 30 years, and she asked in the note only that he remember that his father had loved him more than he had ever been able to say, and that the inability to say it had been the great sorrow of a life otherwise blessed. That mattered because in every royal family there is one person whose role it is to translate silences into words after it is too late for the words to be spoken directly, and she had accepted that role a long time ago, and she carried it now with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime rehearsing for exactly this evening. The prince's own children, too young to fully understand the mechanisms of state but old enough to feel the shift in the air of the house, were told only that grandfather was very unwell, that mother and father would need to be away more often for a little while, and that they would be looked after and loved and kept close. The eldest asked whether grandfather was going to die. The Princess of Wales, who had prepared herself for exactly this question and had rehearsed a dozen careful answers, chose in the end the simplest one. She said that she did not know, that no one knew, and that the most important thing they could do was to love him now while he was still with them, and to trust that whatever came next, the family would be together. That mattered because honesty in the presence of a child is not a policy, it is a covenant. And in that small exchange, in a bedroom lit by a single lamp, another quiet transfer was taking place, a transfer of a certain kind of parenthood from a mother who had learned it from her own mother, to children who would one day, in their own way, carry it further. Outside, the crowd at the gates had grown throughout the evening, though it remained, in a way that would strike many observers later, unusually quiet. There were no chants, there were no signs. There were only flowers laid in loose, uneven rows along the railings, and candles, lit by hands that shielded them against a light wind, and faces turned upward toward windows that revealed nothing. A broadcaster, standing at a distance with a microphone lowered, spoke to camera in a tone stripped of every trace of performance. He said only that the country was waiting. He said that it was not yet a moment for words. He said that whatever came next, the nation would meet it as it had met such moments before, together, in silence, in the dark, in the strange and ancient communion of a people who understand that some events do not belong to politics, and do not belong to news, and do not belong to any category the modern world has invented, but belong instead to a much older register of collective feeling that has no name and needs none. Inside the working offices of the household, the drafts of the official announcements were being prepared in 3 versions, as protocol required. One version was written for the announcement of the Regency alone. One was written for the announcement of the Regency in combination with a further deterioration. One was written for a possibility that no one in the room was willing to name aloud, but which every person in the room understood. Each version was reviewed, revised, and set aside in a locked drawer, to be retrieved only when the moment required it. That mattered because the machinery of monarchy does not permit surprise. It permits only readiness. And readiness, in the language of the household, is the highest form of respect that can be paid to a sovereign who has spent his life being ready for others. The Prince of Wales returned, late that evening, to the small study where the folder had been signed. He did not sit in his father's chair. He sat in the chair he had always sat in as a visitor, and he remained there for a long time, looking at the desk, at the lamp, at the small silver tray with its capped pen. He was thinking, though he would never fully describe it, of the first time his father had brought him into this room as a boy, and of the way the light had fallen then, and of the way it fell now, and of the strange dislocating truth that a room can remain exactly the same while everything inside it changes forever. He was thinking, too, of the walk he would take the following morning, past the same portraits, past the same windows, into the same corridors, but as a different man. The reluctant successor had accepted. The bridge had been built. The crossing had begun. He rose at last and left the room. He did not turn off the lamp. He left it burning on a low warm setting, as his father had always left it, and he closed the door behind him with the same care he had used earlier that afternoon in the bedroom upstairs. A member of the household staff, passing along the corridor a few minutes later, saw the light beneath the door and understood, without needing to be told, that the light was to be left as it was. Some rooms on some nights are not to be darkened. Some lamps, on some evenings, are lit for reasons that have nothing to do with visibility, and everything to do with the ancient human need to leave a light burning for someone who may yet be coming home. By the time the country woke the following morning, the formal language of the announcement would already be moving through the appropriate channels. The newspapers would be arriving on doorsteps with their restrained headlines. The broadcasters would be reading their carefully worded scripts, and the machinery of the crown would be functioning, quietly and precisely, as it had functioned through every previous transition in a history that stretches beyond the memory of any living person. The Regency would be in the strict legal sense a technical arrangement. It would be in the deeper sense a human one. A father had chosen the hour, a son had accepted the weight, a wife had held the household, a sister had written a letter, a brother had asked about supper, a daughter-in-law had answered a child's honest question with honesty of her own. A country had gathered at a gate in the dark and laid flowers on cold iron. The king gave his son honesty, in a bedroom that had no witnesses. The son gave his father presents, in a chair beside a bed. The queen gave the household its steadiness in the small, invisible way she had given it for decades. The Princess of Wales gave the children the truth. They were old enough to hear, and the shelter they were still young enough to need. The sister gave the family a letter that translated a lifetime of unspoken love into a single page of legible grief. The brother gave the moment his quiet, unregarded loyalty in a question about a meal. The country gave, in return, what countries always give in such hours, the only thing they have to give, which is their attention, offered in silence, at a gate, in the cold, under a sky that had seen this happen before and would in time see it happen again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.